So I'm going to show how to do a galaxy pattern with watercolors. It's a wet on wet technique, which means that your paper has to be wet while you're working on it. So I've got water. For galaxy, you want the edges to flow into each other, which happens when your paper is wet. I usually start off with some of the lighter colors and then build on it. So I'm just wetting a little bit at a time, because if you wet too much of your paper, by the time you work on it, it's going to get dry. So I'm going to get kind of a darkish blue. Also, a note about different paint brands is they look different. So this one's Crayola. It's the big set. I like these because the blue and purple and green are really bright and pretty. And then I also have a set of Prang. It's a different brand. You can get these, I don't think they have them at Walmart, but they have them at Michael's and most craft stores. And the black and the blue and the purple are really dark on that brand. So I usually do both, depending on what I need. But as I'm adding the color, see how it's spreading into the water? And I always keep my edge wet. If I start to get close to the edge of where the paper's dry, I wet a little bit more. I'm just blobbing the paint on in uneven spots. If there's white spots, that's fine. Because if you ever look at like the pictures that the Hubble telescope took, space has a lot of brightness, especially in these nebulas. Kind of a more violet purple. I apologize for the shaking. The table that it's sitting on is really wobbly because my actual desk is covered in stuff right now. Again, I'm getting close to where the paper's dry, and I don't want there to be a hard edge, so I'm just going to keep doing this. I think it's time for black. So again, I'm going with the black from the Prang set, which you can see here is a very intense black. But again, when I add it to that water, it's still going to spread. And it's going to lighten up. So I'm going to do a couple layers. You can use the brush to kind of steer where you want the paint to go. You don't have to let it stay completely random. I'm going to make it look like it's going in between these nebulous clouds here. At the end, once it's dried out, I'm going to put a dark edge. Now, I don't like this gray area. I think it looks kind of boring. Wash my brush better. It's another thing too, is if your paint starts to look dull, make sure that you don't have any water on any paint on your brush. So I'm going to spread this water, and I'm going to go back in with my bright blue. Get some of these dry spots. Now I am going to add some green, because I love on the Hubble Space Telescope pictures, they have these little warm tone areas of green and yellow too, that you wouldn't really expect in space, but I think they look really cool. These star forming regions. I'm going to warm up this pink area a little bit with some orange. Also, if you have a little too much maybe of a color, you can scoop it up by drying your brush or with a tissue. Just gently blot it. And I'm going to go back in with this red violet and kind of blend that a little bit better. So even though it's a kind of random way of painting, you can control. If you don't like how something looks, if it's not interesting enough or you want to go back into it, you can make decisions for how random you actually want to let it get. I'm just going to keep going on this. But that's the gist of how to do galaxy. Blob your paint on. You don't want to be too big of an area at once. because you'll start to like spread out. But there you go, that's Galaxy. Another trick you can do while your paint is still wet enough to like move, but not really puddly, is you can put salt on it. Normally I use just really cheap salt, but I ran out, so I'm using sea salt. But let it dry. You want to make sure that that salt is all the way dry. I'm going to do another spot to show just how wet to leave it. Oops, forgot to wet my paper. Now, it feels damp to the touch, but it's not puddly. In the light, you can kind of see how it's just shiny. That's a good amount of water to use if you're starting a wet into wet paint. You don't want to necessarily have it be really, really soaking wet and puddly, because when you paint, you're going to add water to it. So you start with just like a light coating of water, and then as you add paint, your water's going to add on. I'm going to use a bit of the blue and purple from the other set, the Prang set, and I always test them. See how that's a darker purple? I kind of like that. And then that's like a really deep royal blue. Now the edge, because the paper's curling, is very watery. The water's actually puddling on the edge of the paper, so I'm going to work down here. But I like that deep royal blue that's on that other Prang set. And I'm going to add a little of the Crayola bright blue to it. And I'm going to add a little of the Prang purple. So you can see the difference in the richness of color. This purple and this purple are pretty similar. Or not that purple, sorry. This purple. They're pretty similar, but the amount of color that's actually mixed in, the amount of pigment, is different between the two brands. I always put the salt on my hand before I put it on the painting, just because I can use my fingers to give a bit more control. Try to not have the salt pieces actually touch. So I'm going to set this aside to dry. It has to dry all the way for it to work, but you can see here it's starting to do its thing. What happens is as the salt dissolves, it makes the water more dense where the salt water is, and it pushes the paint out of the way. So it's going to give you kind of a starry, speckled look. We'll let this dry, and then I'll brush the salt off and show you. Alright, so the salt did its thing. I used, like I said, I used sea salt on this, and I'm rubbing off the salt grains. Now, sea salt dissolves apparently way more than normal table salt. So it made really large spots. I think it looks cool. It doesn't exactly look like stars. So I painted a second or a third, I guess, little nebula area. And on this one, I left it alone. I mean, I didn't leave it alone. I put fewer salt grains. I tried to sprinkle them only where I thought a star might be inside the nebula. So it's a little bit more controlled use of salt. And then this one also I used, down here it actually did exactly what I wanted, because the salts were farther apart. Up here they were too close together, and it ended up just flooding out the paint. Again though, it looks kind of cool if you were going for more of like a hazy look. So this is something that you would play around with, I think, and test. If I was painting tree leaves, I was thinking this might look really cool for the shade that's underneath the tree, how the tree leaves make like a spotty dappled shade like that. So that's something I might keep in mind for later. But I really like how these stars came out here inside the nebula because I sprinkled the salt a little bit farther apart. So that's that. And you have to let it dry. This took about 25 minutes to dry enough to where I could brush the salt off without smudging it.